Hello, and welcome to our latest episode 6 of Technically Speaking. I have a very special guest with me today, Tony Shapiro-Bey from our application engineering team. Tony, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, everyone. As Dara said, I'm Tony Shapiro-Bey. I'm Application Engineering Manager here at Unqork. So working with our insurance vertical and building out, scalable solutions for our clients here. So I'm excited to be chatting with everyone today.
And we are very excited to have you because you are one of our experts in our topic for today, debugging.
Yes.
So I'm going to start with what is your first step? You get a problem and you have to debug it. Where do you start?
I always start with questions, just so I understand like what I'm dealing with. So it's a series of questions that are something like, how many people is this affecting? Um, is this something that's blocking all users or a specific user? Um, is this happening on a particular browser versus another browser? I start to just like ask questions like that so it can allow me to narrow down where I need to focus my energy. Because sometimes we may see things happen differently depending on what device you're using, who the user is. Maybe there's a permission thing. So that's typically the first step. It's just trying to collect as much information about the problem. So where it's at, who is affected, um, what environment, is this happening across different environments or just a single environment? Is it an API call? Is it not an API call? Try to just get as much information as possible.
That's amazing advice. We love questions on this channel, as I'm sure you've heard, and all of our viewers have heard. And those are really good questions. The isolation of the issue, I think, is sometimes the hardest part of debugging. And coming up with that list is amazing. But once you're done with your questions, are there tools that you use as kind of your second step that people should know about?
Yeah, so it mostly kicks off because we're working on Cork. There are tools that are available to us. The biggest one that I find myself using the most is just using the inspect element, so the console log. So it could be a variation of just like looking at the data, seeing what's happening in the background, are values being set, are values being cleared, and also just looking at the log to see like what's being fired. I think I get a lot of my information from there first, so I can at least understand, okay, the data's there or the data's not there. I see that the let's just say the components, the logical components like a rule or a decision or a calculator or a data workflow, um, are firing off and setting the values, or is it not firing off and there's an error. I can start to just like use the log as my primary tool when I first start my investigation. So I think that would be my favorite to at least start with.
And are there Unqork specific tools? I know you spoke about a few things that are browser native that we're able to get some pieces from. Are there ones that people may not be familiar with because Unqork is a relatively new tool or they're new to Unqork?
Yeah, so I have about like five like specific areas that I will start with. So in Uncork, with our decision component, our calculator component, and our data workflow component, we have in component unit testing. I use that fairly often to check the values just to make sure that the outputs are getting set correctly. So you can build it up, use like sample data in the in component unit test itself, and run some tests just to make sure that whatever logic you've built inside the components is outputting exactly what you need it to be. Because sometimes it could just be like a logic thing, or maybe like a syntax thing that's breaking. So I like to use those for sure. Another thing is really specifically for the data workflow. I think this is something that not a lot of people use, but the show table I find to be like very important. And the reason why it's important to me, it's because it allows you to see the order of execution of how the data workflow is sort of like firing off each output. So sometimes you might have a situation where you want to trigger a rule to go after the data workflow ends, but you need a specific value that's getting created in the data workflow to be set before that rule can fire. So a lot of times what ends up happening is the order of operation of the outputs are not in the right sequence. So you may need to look at the show table that will give you a little bit of more information about, all right, my value is getting set after I'm triggering this component, so it's gonna fail. So let me fix that and flip them, and so I can set my value before I trigger the next component. Those are some things that I do on, let's say, the modular level. And then on the environment level, we have our UDLC toolkit, which has a various sort of like subset of like tools that we can use. So some of the big ones that I like to use is obviously the service logs. So service logs will be available for whenever you're doing remote executes or testing out API calls. This will allow you to look at what's going into the request, what's coming back for the response, and just making sure those values are what you're expecting to see. It would also give you some information about if there was a failure, if there was a success, who the user was, if it's this. And you can start to say like, okay, this failed here because of this, and then that can allow you to take that information and maybe go start debugging about like what actually happened. Other than that, there are other tools like config analysis report. You can run that. It will give you some information about sort of like things that we call out that are like not in the best practice. This will say like, let's say you have like a decision component on watch all throughout your application. So that's like one of the big ones that I see. And what I really, really like try to encourage people to do is really try to control your components. So if you have a lot of things on watch, try to figure out the logic so you can trigger a chain of commands or a chain of sequence to make sure you fire things when they need to be fired. So they don't just fire whenever they want to fire, because like you can't really control when things are on watch. So really, the synopsis that I just gave you is some of the main areas in which I start with to really try to debug and use some of these Unqork specific tools.
Yeah, and I love what you just brought in there, because it is one of those tips that I think people gloss over is, you're if you're really just, I don't know where to start, I haven't been able to isolate this, looking at where are there best practices violations and is there a spot where we have a lot of them, really will give you that, okay, start here, start unraveling here, and we'll find where that issue is. And sometimes that extra step really does make things much easier.
Yes, it definitely
Um,
does.
with that, I do have a question. What is your favorite debugging puzzle? Because they are all puzzles that you have worked on while at Unqork.
I mean, I think there are a lot of, I'm not saying that like there are like a lot of like bad things, but obviously like we're a new platform, so it's you kind of have to put on your detective hat, and some things you can't just like Google like how to do something, so you gotta like figure it out. So a lot of times, let's just say it's mainly like data manipulation, seeing where like breaks happen. We'll have a client send us sort of like a JSON file that they want to sort of transform that data so that we can output it and make it displayable on the screen. Sometimes that just takes a little bit of time, and you have to do some validation checks, like if it's a string, it's a number, if it's an array, and sometimes you might get some breakage because let's just say in your data workflow is accommodating a string, but it's not accommodating an array. So you're going to get like an error, or like the data itself might get a little bit corrupted because it's not sort of like appropriately handling that sort of like data element or attribute itself. So some of those are the big puzzles when you're just like working with large data, and just making sure you have the right syntax, the right components, the right operators and data workflows, just to make sure your data is coming out smoothly. And depending on like how large the data is, it might just take you a little bit more extra time to really use your expected gadget eye and make sure you catch everything, because it's all about being very thorough and making sure you're delivering quality work.
Okay. Well, before I ask Tony to sum up what we just talked about, if you did enjoy this and you want more details on how we debug and deeper dives into some of the tools we listed out, let us know in those comments. But Tony, do you have a one sentencer that you would want people to think about when it comes to introduction to debugging and troubleshooting?
Yeah, so when it comes to debugging, I always want you to say, I can figure this out, and I'm going to need to expand the way I think about things a little bit differently. Because a lot of times what ends up happening is people have like a very linear or like one approach to looking at an issue. And you kind of have to expand your brain or expand the way you think about things to look at it from like all different sides. And in that way, you might fix it, or you might come up with a better solution. Or you might find out like maybe just something isn't possible in this moment. But if you allow yourself to think about maybe there's a better solution rather than fixing the bug, like, oh, we could have done it this way, but the way we have it is like not the best approach. Sometimes you gotta expand that out a little bit and not just think about the bug specifically sometimes.
All right.
Yeah.
That is great advice. Thank you, Tony, for being here with us today. And we will see you all next week.
All right. Thank you all. It was a pleasure being here with you today.